Useless. People like you belong doing manual labor, not serving someone like me." The words slithered out in Japanese, hissed across a white tablecloth in one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. The woman who spoke them was Mia Nakamura, Billionaire, tech empire CEO, a name that made grown men look away when she entered a room. The waiter standing before her was black, thin, and carried the kind of exhaustion that only single fathers understand. She was certain he wouldn't comprehend a single syllable of what she had just said. Then he looked up, met her eyes, and replied in flawless Japanese. And in that moment, everything she thought she knew about power came crashing down. 3 hours earlier, Ethan Brooks stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his black tie while studying the face that stared back at him. 32 years old, with dark circles carved beneath his eyes, and hands that had once held linguistics textbooks, but now spent their nights carrying serving trays. He had been a different person once, not so long ago. Top of his class at Columbia, fluent in 4 languages, English, Japanese, French, and Spanish. His professors had spoken of graduate programs and research positions, painting pictures of a future built entirely on his gift for words. Then Olivia died, and all those pictures burned to ash. A car accident on a rainy Tuesday afternoon had reduced his entire world to a single phone call. He dropped out 3 credits shy of graduation, sold the car they had bought together, and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn that smelled of old paint and quiet desperation. The first job that would pay enough to keep the lights on was night shifts at Lumiere, one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York City. That was 4 years ago. And now his entire world fit into 700 square feet and one small person. "Daddy." Ethan turned to find Emma standing in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper against her chest. 6 years old, with her mother's eyes and his own stubborn chin, she was the only thing that made any of this bearable. "What's that, baby girl?" She held up the drawing with the solemnity of a child presenting a masterpiece. 2 stick figures stood beneath a yellow sun, one tall, one small, and above them, wobbly Japanese characters spelled out. "It says, 'I love Daddy,'" Emma announced proudly, her face glowing with anticipation. "Did I write it right?" Ethan knelt down and examined the characters with exaggerated seriousness, the way he always did during their morning Japanese lessons. Those lessons had become his favorite part of each day. A small ritual that kept his mind sharp and Olivia's memory alive. She had loved languages, too, had been the one who first encouraged him to study Japanese. And teaching Emma felt like keeping a promise he had never formally made. "Almost perfect," he said, pointing to one of the characters. "The second stroke on love should go the other way, but I can read it clearly, and I love you too." Emma beamed at him, but her smile faded almost immediately into something more fragile. "Do you have to go to work?" "I do, sweetheart. But you always go when I'm sleeping, and you come back when I'm sleeping too. I never get to see you anymore." The words landed in Ethan's chest like small stones. He pulled her close, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo, and wished for the 1,000th time that things could be different. "I know it's hard," he said softly, "but Daddy has to work so we can keep our apartment and so you can go to school. It's how we get to have our Japanese lessons every morning." "I don't like it." "I don't like it either, baby girl. But sometimes we have to do hard things, even when they hurt." He kissed her forehead and stood up, his eyes drifting to the kitchen table where a stack of envelopes waited like patient executioners. Rent was 2 weeks overdue. The electric bill had arrived with final notice stamped across the front, and Emma's preschool tuition remained unpaid for the month. Each envelope represented a choice he couldn't afford to make, a sacrifice he couldn't afford to skip. He needed this job. He needed every single shift they would give him. Mrs. Jenkins from next door arrived at 6 sharp to watch Emma, the same as she did every night Ethan worked. She was 73 years old, half-deaf, and charged $20 a night. All that Ethan could afford, and probably less than she deserved. She settled into the couch with her knitting while Emma curled up beside her, already drowsy. "I'll be back before she wakes up," Ethan promised from the doorway. "You always are, honey. Go on now. Don't be late." Ethan took one last look at his daughter, watching her eyes flutter closed with the drawing still clutched in her small hand. Then he stepped into the hallway, closed the door quietly behind him, and headed out into the night. Lumiere occupied the entire top floor of a building that overlooked Central Park, the kind of place where the elevator ride alone cost more than Ethan made in a month. Everything inside had been designed to make ordinary people feel small. The soaring ceilings that seemed to stretch toward heaven, the hushed voices that floated like whispers in a cathedral, the waitstaff who glided between tables like ghosts, afraid to disturb the living. Ethan had learned to be invisible here, had perfected the art of existing without being seen. It was safer that way, easier to survive. The wealthy clients who dined at Lumiere rarely acknowledged the people who served them, preferring instead to see uniforms and functions rather than human beings. Some were polite in the distant way that people are polite to furniture. Most were simply indifferent, their eyes sliding past him as though he were made of glass. A few, however, were deliberately cruel, and Ethan had experienced every variation of that cruelty over the past 4 years. He had been called names that would have started fights in any other context. He had watched drinks thrown at colleagues for imaginary offenses. He had endured a woman snapping her fingers at him as though summoning a dog. He had swallowed every insult, absorbed every humiliation, because that was what the job required, because Emma needed new shoes, and the landlord didn't accept dignity as a form of payment. Tonight, however, the restaurant buzzed with an unusual tension that Ethan noticed the moment he walked into the staff room. The other servers had gathered in corners, their voices reduced to anxious whispers, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. Harold, the floor manager, spotted Ethan immediately and hurried over with the desperate relief of a drowning man spotting a life raft. Harold was a nervous man in his 50s who perpetually sweated through his shirts and lived in constant fear of negative reviews. "Ethan, thank God you're here. We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" "VIP tonight in the private dining room. Mia Nakamura." The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples of unease through Ethan's stomach. Everyone in the service industry knew that name and the reputation attached to it. Mia Nakamura was the CEO of Nakamura Industries, a tech billionaire who appeared regularly on Forbes lists and in the nightmares of restaurant workers across Manhattan. 3 servers had been fired after serving her table at various establishments, not because they had made actual mistakes, but because she had decided they had. "She specifically requested a male server," Harold continued, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "Something about professionalism. You're the only man on shift tonight." "So, I'm serving her table." "You're serving her table?" Ethan studied Harold's sweating face and asked the question they were both thinking. "And if something goes wrong?" Harold didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The silence said everything. If Mia Nakamura complained, Ethan was finished, not just at Lumiere, but everywhere. Her influence stretched across the entire hospitality industry in Manhattan like a spider's web. And one word from her could get him blacklisted from every restaurant that mattered. No job meant no rent meant no apartment, and no apartment meant consequences too terrible to contemplate. He stopped himself from following that thought to its conclusion. "I'll handle it," Ethan said, and he almost believed it. She arrived at exactly 8 Akranwing, sweeping through the restaurant like a general inspecting conquered territory. Her black suit was tailored so perfectly it might have been painted onto her body, and her hair was pulled back with a severity that looked almost painful. Her eyes moved across the room with cold efficiency, assessing and dismissing everything they touched in the same glance. Behind her trailed an entourage of obvious importance, a nervous assistant clutching a tablet like a shield, 2 men in expensive suits who could have been lawyers or bodyguards, and a silver-haired woman Ethan recognized from the covers of business magazines. These were industry partners, people whose names appeared in headlines and whose decisions moved markets. The private dining room had been prepared with military precision, every detail attended to with obsessive care. Fresh flowers arranged just so, the temperature set to exactly 70 degrees. Specific brands of water waiting on the sideboard in both still and sparkling varieties. Nothing had been left to chance, because with a client like Mia Nakamura, chance was just another word for disaster. Ethan took his position against the wall, back straight, face carefully neutral, doing his best to become part of the furniture, invisible, forgettable, safe. Mia's gaze swept the room and landed on him with the weight of a physical blow. Something flickered in her expression. Displeasure quickly masked behind a wall of professional composure, and she turned to murmur something to her assistant in rapid Japanese. Why did they assign someone like him to serve us? Her tone carried the kind of dismissive boredom usually reserved for complaining about weather or traffic, as though his presence were an inconvenience, roughly equivalent to a coffee stain on the tablecloth. Ethan kept his face perfectly blank, his heart rate steady through sheer force of will. He had understood every word, but she would never know that, not unless she gave him a reason to reveal it. The party settled into their seats, and Ethan began the intricate choreography he had perfected over 4 years of service. Water poured at the precise angle, bread presented with practiced grace, the evening's menu explained in tones that conveyed information without demanding attention. His movements were economical and precise, his voice calm and measured, and for the first hour everything proceeded without incident. Then, at 9:15, the careful balance shattered. Ethan approached the table with a crystal pitcher to refill water glasses, moving with the deliberate care he always employed around VIP guests. He leaned slightly to reach Mia's glass, his body angled to minimize intrusion when one of the lawyers shifted his chair backward without warning or apology. The chair struck Ethan's arm with enough force to jar his grip. The pitcher tilted, and 3 drops of water, no more than that, barely enough to notice, landed on the sleeve of Mia's jacket. 3 drops, worth perhaps a fraction of a penny, on a sleeve that probably cost $3,000. Mia looked at her arm with an expression of theatrical disgust, then raised her eyes to Ethan's face. The temperature in her gaze dropped to something approaching absolute 0. She leaned toward him close enough that only he could hear, and unleashed a torrent of Japanese that dripped with decades of accumulated contempt. "You clumsy fool, completely useless. People like you are only fit for manual labor. You shouldn't even be allowed in a place like this. Let me guess. Some pathetic single father who can't even take care of his own child properly, and now you're here spilling water on people who actually matter in this world. Disgusting. Truly pathetic." Every word was a blade, aimed with surgical precision at the softest parts of him. At the table, the other guests continued their conversation as though nothing had happened, oblivious to the violence being committed in a language they didn't understand. But Ethan understood everything. He stood frozen with the pitcher still in his hand, his mind racing through a familiar calculus of survival, the bills on his kitchen table, Emma's sleeping face, Mrs. Jenkins's $20, the blacklist that would destroy everything he had built from the wreckage of his former life. Every instinct screamed at him to apologize, to bow his head and absorb the insult the way he had absorbed every insult before. To be invisible, forgettable, safe. But she had mentioned his daughter. She had called him pathetic for being a single father, had weaponized his greatest love against him in a language she assumed he couldn't understand. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted inside Ethan Brooks. He thought about the words he spoke to Emma every morning, the mantra he repeated like a prayer until she could say it back to him. Our dignity doesn't depend on how much money we have. It depends on how we treat ourselves and others. He had taught her to believe that. The question was whether he believed it himself and whether he believed it enough to risk everything. Ethan looked at Mia Nakamura, this woman who could end his career with a single phone call, who held his family's future in her manicured hands and felt the full weight of his poverty, his exhaustion, his fear pressing down on him like a physical force. Then, with absolute clarity, he made his choice. Ethan straightened his spine and looked directly into Mia Nakamura's eyes, violating every unwritten rule about how servers were supposed to interact with VIP guests. When he spoke, his Japanese was Tokyo standard, polished and precise, the product of university classrooms and years of dedicated study. "Nakamura-san, I understood everything you just said, every single word." The color drained from Mia's face with almost comic speed, leaving her complexion the shade of old parchment. Around them, the other guests continued their conversation, completely unaware that the ground beneath the table had just shifted. Ethan continued in the same measured tone, each word placed with deliberate care. "I'd like to point out a few things, if you'll permit me. First, you use the wrong honorific form when referring to me, a grammatical error that anyone with a proper Japanese education would never make. Second, you insulted my daughter without knowing the first thing about her. She's 6 years old, and she's learning Japanese. This morning she drew me a picture with the words, 'I love Daddy,' written in hiragana. And she's the entire reason I'm standing here tonight serving people like you, swallowing insults so I can afford to pay for her schooling." Mia's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. For perhaps the first time in years, she had been rendered completely speechless. "Third," Ethan continued, "I didn't spill the water. The gentleman beside you pushed his chair into my arm without looking. But you didn't notice that, did you? You saw what you expected to see. A black man making a mistake that confirmed everything you already believed about people who look like me." The silver-haired woman at the far end of the table had stopped talking mid-sentence, her attention drawn by something in the air that she couldn't quite identify. She stared at Ethan now, sensing that something seismic was unfolding just beyond her comprehension. "But what matters most is this." Ethan set the water pitcher down on the sideboard with careful precision, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "My dignity is not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone, not at any price. Being a single father is not a weakness to be mocked. Working this job is not a shame to be exploited. The only shameful thing in this room tonight is judging another person's worth by the color of their skin or the size of their bank account." He offered a small bow, proper and correct, the kind that conveyed respect without a trace of submission. "I apologize sincerely for the water on your sleeve, but I will never apologize for who I am." Silence descended on the private dining room like a heavy curtain falling. The silver-haired woman sat frozen with her glass halfway to her lips. The lawyers had abandoned all pretense of checking their phones. Even Mia's assistant, who had been typing furiously on her tablet throughout dinner, sat motionless with her fingers suspended above the keys. And Mia Nakamura, the woman whose name made CEOs stammer and board members break into cold sweats, sat in perfect stillness, her expression impossible to read. The moment stretched until it seemed like time itself might snap. Then Harold burst through the door like a man fleeing a burning building. The floor manager had been watching through the window, and his face had turned the color of old newspaper. Sweat stains had spread across his shirt like continents forming on a map of anxiety. Mr. Brooks. His voice cracked on the name. A word outside now. Ethan followed him into the hallway, feeling every pair of eyes in the room tracking his departure, like searchlights following an escaped prisoner. The hallway outside the private dining room existed in a different universe, one where the air tasted like fear, and the walls seemed to press inward with judgment. Harold paced in tight, frantic circles, running trembling hands through what little remained of his hair. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" The words emerged as a hiss, barely controlled. "That woman could buy this entire restaurant and fire every single one of us before she finishes her breakfast tomorrow. She could make one phone call, just one, and you would never work in this city again. In any city." Ethan stood with his hands clasped behind his back, willing his pounding heart to slow. His voice, when he found it, came out remarkably calm. "She insulted me. She insulted my daughter. I responded with the truth." "You responded? You responded?" Harold's voice climbed toward hysteria. "You were supposed to apologize. You were supposed to bow and scrape and thank her for the incredible privilege of being humiliated. That's how this works. That's how it has always worked." "Then maybe how it works is wrong." Harold stopped his frantic pacing and stared at Ethan as though seeing him for the first time, and as though what he saw terrified him beyond words. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Go home. I'll call you if we figure out how to handle the aftermath of this disaster." "Suspended. It's the best I can do and probably more than you deserve. If she complains, when she complains, the owners are going to demand blood. Consider this me trying to protect whatever's left of your career." Ethan untied his apron with steady hands, folded it neatly, and set it on a nearby table. "You're not protecting me, Harold. You're protecting the restaurant. There's a world of difference between those two things." He walked towards the service elevator without looking back. Harold's muttered commentary about careers and professional suicide fading behind him like radio static. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, the doors sliding open to reveal his own reflection in the polished metal walls. He looked tired in that reflection. He looked scared, but somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the fear, he also looked like a man who had remembered something essential about himself, something he had almost allowed the world to strip away. The elevator reached the ground floor and released him into the cold New York night. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk, technically unemployed, profoundly uncertain about what came next, but standing straighter than he had in 4 long years. The apartment was silent when Ethan arrived home, filled with the particular quiet of sleeping children and tired old women. Mrs. Jenkins had fallen asleep on the couch with her knitting needles still clutched in her weathered hands, and Ethan paid her the $20 he couldn't really afford before helping her gently to the door. "Everything all right, honey?" She squinted at him through sleep-clouded eyes. "You're home much earlier than usual." "Everything's fine, Mrs. Jenkins. Thank you for watching her." He closed the door behind her and stood alone in the darkness for a long moment, listening to the silence. The apartment felt smaller than it had that afternoon, the walls pressing closer, the air thick with uncertainty, and all the things he couldn't control. Ethan moved quietly down the short hallway to Emma's room. She lay curled on her side beneath her purple comforter, one arm wrapped around a stuffed elephant that had been Olivia's last gift to her. In her other hand, she still clutched the drawing, the 2 stick figures beneath the yellow sun, the wobbly Japanese characters proclaiming her love. "Papa Dahoki, I love Daddy." He knelt beside her bed and watched her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her small chest. In sleep, with her face relaxed and peaceful, she looked so much like Olivia that the resemblance made his chest ache with a grief that never quite went away. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he whispered into the darkness. "I don't know what happens next, but I promise I'll figure it out. I always figure it out." Emma stirred slightly, but didn't wake, her fingers tightening around the drawing as though it were a lifeline. Ethan pulled her blanket up to her chin, brushed a kiss across her forehead, and left the room as quietly as he had entered. In the kitchen, the stack of bills waited on the table with patient malevolence. Ethan sat down and spread them out one by one, forcing himself to confront the numbers. Rent, $800 overdue and counting. Electric, $147, final notice before disconnection. Preschool tuition, $350 due by Friday, or Emma would lose her spot, almost $100 to $300 in immediate debts, $62 in his checking account. Ethan lowered his head into his hands and felt for the first time in 4 years the complete absence of a plan. No backup strategy, no safety net, no clever solution waiting to be discovered. He had defended his dignity, had stood up for himself and his daughter in a way he could be proud of, and it might very well cost him everything. Across Manhattan, in a penthouse apartment that commanded views of the glittering city in every direction, Mia Nakamura discovered that she could not sleep. She stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows with a glass of expensive whiskey untouched in her hand, staring at the light spread below her like scattered diamonds. The waiter's words kept echoing through her mind, refusing to fade into background noise the way other people's words always did. "My dignity is not for sale." Something about the way he had spoken, the steadiness in his voice, the absolute refusal to bend or break. Something about his eyes, exhausted beyond measure, yet somehow unbroken, unbowed. She had seen eyes like that before, in a mirror, 20 years and a lifetime ago. The memory surfaced without permission, sharp and painful as broken glass pressed against skin. Osaka, 1994. She was 16 years old, the daughter of factory workers who had left their village in search of opportunities that never quite materialized. They found only longer hours and smaller paychecks. Dreams deferred until they eventually stopped dreaming at all. Young Mia worked evenings at a restaurant near the business district, serving wealthy men in expensive suits who never bothered to look at her face. One night, a customer, drunk on whiskey, and his own sense of superiority knocked over his glass and immediately blamed her for the accident. When she knelt to clean up the mess, he leaned down close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath and spoke words that had burned themselves permanently into her memory. "Useless. People like you are only fit for manual labor. Pathetic." She remembered the heat flooding her face, the trembling in her hands, the desperate urge to scream or strike or do something, anything, to push back against the injustice of it. She remembered wanting to throw the broken glass in his smug face to tell him that she was worth more than he could possibly understand. Instead, she had apologized. She had bowed. She had cleaned up his mess while he laughed with his companions about clumsy serving girls. That night, walking home through streets that smelled of rain and diesel exhaust, she had made herself a promise. She would become so rich, so powerful, so untouchable that no one would ever dare speak to her that way again. She would climb so impossibly high that men like him would have to crane their necks just to see her shadow. And she had done it. She had clawed her way out of poverty with fingernails and determination, built an empire from nothing but ambition and refusal to quit, transformed herself into the woman that CEOs feared and magazines celebrated. But tonight, standing in her penthouse with the city spread beneath her like a kingdom she had conquered through sheer force of will, Mia realized something that made her physically ill. She had become him, the drunk man in the Osaka restaurant, the one who looked at working people and saw nothing worth respecting, nothing worth treating with basic human decency. She had become the very thing she had sworn to destroy. The whiskey glass trembled in her hand, and she set it down carefully before she could drop it and shatter something else. The waiter's face floated in her memory. Ethan. Someone had called him Ethan during the commotion. A linguistics student who had abandoned his education. A single father working night shifts so his daughter could attend school. A man who had looked at one of the most powerful women in New York City and flatly refused to be diminished. Mia walked to her desk and picked up her phone, dialing a number she knew would be answered regardless of the hour. Sophia. Her assistant's voice was alert despite the late hour, trained through years of service to be available whenever needed. I need you to find someone for me. His name is Ethan and he worked at Lumiere. I want his full name and address on my desk by 7 a.m. sharp. She ended the call without waiting for confirmation and returned to the window, staring out at the lights of the city she had worked so hard to conquer. Tomorrow she would attempt something she hadn't done in over 20 years. Tomorrow she would try to make things right. The knock came at 8:00 in the morning. Ethan had been awake all night, sitting at the kitchen table and staring at numbers that steadfastly refused to add up, no matter how many times he rearranged them. Emma was still asleep in her room, innocent of the disaster unfolding around her, and he wanted to preserve that innocence for as long as possible. He opened the door to find a young woman in a crisp gray suit standing in the hallway. Everything about her projected an air of absolute certainty, from her perfect posture to her unwavering gaze. She looked like someone who had never experienced a moment of genuine uncertainty in her entire life. Mr. Brooks, Mr. Ethan Brooks. That's me. She extended her hand, offering a cream-colored envelope and a business card made of paper so thick and expensive it felt more like fabric than cardstock. Miss Nakamura requests your presence at Nakamura Industries headquarters this morning. 10 Monceau M. A car will be waiting downstairs at 9:30 should you choose to accept the invitation. Before Ethan could formulate her response, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking a precise rhythm against the hallway floor until she disappeared around the corner. He closed the door slowly and examined the envelope in his hands. His name was written on the front in elegant script, the kind of handwriting that suggested expensive education and careful attention to detail. Inside was a single card bearing an address on 5th Avenue and one handwritten line. This is not revenge. This is a conversation. Ethan read those 7 words 3 times, trying to decode their meaning. His mind cycled through possibilities, a trap designed to humiliate him further. A legal threat wrapped in polite packaging, some elaborate power play intended to remind him of his place in the world. But something about the handwriting itself gave him pause. The letters were careful, almost hesitant, with none of the bold confidence he would have expected from the cold, commanding woman who had insulted him the night before. Behind him, the soft sound of small footsteps announced Emma's arrival in the kitchen. "Daddy." She stood in the hallway entrance, rubbing sleep from her eyes with both fists. "You're still here. You never went to sleep." Ethan turned and smiled, sliding the envelope behind his back with a casual movement. "I'm here, baby girl. I'll always be here." "Promise." "Promise." He looked at his daughter. This small person who was the reason he had endured every insult, worked every exhausting overnight shift, swallowed every piece of his pride for 4 long years. Then he looked at the envelope hidden in his hand, feeling its weight like a question waiting to be answered. Whatever Mia Nakamura wanted from him, he would face it directly, not because he trusted her intentions, but because he had already lost his job, already lost his safety net, already lost everything except his dignity, and that he had decided once and for all was no longer up for negotiation. The black car waiting outside Ethan's building was worth more than everything he owned combined. The driver opened the rear door without speaking, and Ethan slid onto leather seats that probably cost more than his annual rent at Lumiere. He had left Emma in Mrs. Jenkins's capable hands, promising to return before lunch. The elderly woman had studied his face with obvious concern, but asked no questions. She had seen the sleepless night written in his features, and knew him well enough to recognize when words wouldn't help. The drive to Fifth Avenue took 20 minutes through morning traffic, and Ethan spent every one of them staring out the tinted windows. He watched the city transform around him, the crumbling Brooklyn walk-ups giving way to gleaming Manhattan towers, two worlds separated by a river and a lifetime of accumulated wealth. The distance between where he lived and where he was going could be measured in miles, but it felt more like the span between different planets. Nakamura Industries occupied a glass building that seemed to pierce the sky like an accusation, its surface reflecting clouds and ambition in equal measure. The lobby alone was larger than Ethan's entire apartment building. All marble floors and soaring ceilings, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that made visitors automatically lower their voices. Security guards nodded respectfully as he approached the reception desk, clearly expecting him. "Mr. Brooks, 50th floor. Ms. Nakamura is waiting for you." The elevator rose in perfect silence, the numbers climbing on the display panel like a countdown to something Ethan couldn't quite name. He thought about all the ways this meeting could go wrong. Lawyers presenting cease and desist orders, threats delivered with corporate politeness, some elaborate scheme designed to punish him for his moment of defiance. But he had made his choice in that restaurant, and whatever came next, he would face it on his feet. The doors opened onto a floor of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Manhattan like a painting worth billions. The assistant from that morning appeared instantly, materializing at his elbow to guide him through a maze of glass-walled offices toward a corner suite that commanded views in every direction. Mia Nakamura sat behind a desk made of dark wood and polished chrome. But in the morning light filtering through the windows, she looked profoundly different from the woman he had confronted the night before. Smaller somehow, less armored, more human. She wore a simple gray blouse instead of the severe black suit, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders instead of being pulled back with painful precision. She stood when he entered, and something in her posture suggested uncertainty, an emotion Ethan would never have associated with her based on their previous encounter. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for coming." Ethan remained near the doorway, maintaining distance. "Your note said, 'This isn't revenge. I'm here to find out what it actually is.'" Mia gestured toward a chair positioned across from her desk, but Ethan made no move to sit. She nodded slowly, as though she had expected exactly that response. "I owe you an apology," she said, and the words seemed to cost her something. "What I said to you last night was inexcusable. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance and your job, and every single one of those assumptions was wrong." "Yes, they were. I've spent the last 12 hours examining why I said those things, trying to understand what made me capable of such cruelty." She moved toward the window, turning her back to him as she gazed out at the city below. "And I realized something deeply uncomfortable about myself. 20 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. Different circumstances, different country, but fundamentally the same situation. A customer in a restaurant looked at me and saw nothing worth respecting. He called me useless, pathetic, told me I was only fit for manual labor." She turned to face him, and Ethan saw something raw and unguarded in her expression. "I swore that night that I would become so powerful that no one would ever dare speak to me that way again. And I succeeded. I built everything I dreamed of building. But somewhere along the way, without ever noticing it happening, I became the exact person I had sworn to destroy. Ethan studied her face carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or performance. He found neither. What he saw instead was the uncomfortable honesty of someone confronting an ugly truth about themselves for the first time. "You looked at me last night," Mia continued, "and you didn't bow. You didn't apologize for existing. You told me I was wrong, and you were absolutely right about everything. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. What exactly do you want from me?" "I want to offer you a job." The words hung suspended in the air between them, completely unexpected. Ethan had prepared himself for many possible outcomes of this meeting. This was not among them. Mia returned to her desk and picked up a folder thick with documents. "I did extensive research this morning. You studied linguistics at Columbia University, where you were at the top of your class before circumstances forced you to leave. You're fluent in 4 languages: Japanese, French, Spanish, and English. You possess exactly the combination of skills that my company desperately needs." She opened the folder and began reading. "I'm offering you a position as International Translation and Coordination Director. You would serve as the primary bridge between our offices in Tokyo, Paris, and New York, facilitating communication across languages and cultures." She looked up to meet his eyes. "The salary is $120,000 annually, plus comprehensive benefits, full health insurance coverage for you and your daughter, and the schedule would be flexible enough that you could take her to school every morning and have dinner with her every evening." $120,000, 5 times what he had earned at Lumiere. Enough to pay every bill on his kitchen table and never worry about them again. Enough to give Emma a real childhood with a father who was actually present instead of a ghost who appeared and disappeared while she slept. It was everything he needed, and it was being offered by the woman who had humiliated him less than 24 hours ago. "Why?" Ethan asked, genuine confusion cutting through his caution. "You could find dozens of qualified candidates for this position, people with completed degrees, people who didn't embarrass you in front of your business partners." "Because I don't need someone who will tell me what I want to hear. I have an entire company full of those people already. What I need is someone who will tell me the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable." Mia closed the folder and set it aside. "You did something last night that no one has done in years. You held up a mirror and forced me to see what I had become. I didn't like what I saw, but that's precisely why I need someone like you." Ethan finally crossed the room and sat down in the offered chair. His mind was racing, calculating risks against possibilities, weighing pride against pragmatism. "If I were to consider this offer," he said carefully, "I would have conditions." "Name them." "3 things." He raised one finger. "First, you will never insult or discriminate against me or any employee because of their race, their background, or their circumstances. Not publicly, not privately, not in any language you assume they don't understand. If I ever witness you speaking to anyone the way you spoke to me last night, I walk away immediately. No second chances, no negotiations." Mia nodded without hesitation. "Agreed." "Second." A second finger joined the first. "My daughter is my absolute priority. I need to leave the office in time to pick her up from school at 3-4 and have dinner with her every single evening. My schedule must accommodate that requirement without exception." "That can easily be arranged." "What's your third condition?" Ethan lowered his hand. This was the condition that mattered most to him, and the one he suspected would be hardest to achieve. "I want you to establish a scholarship fund for children from underprivileged backgrounds who demonstrate a talent for languages. Kids like I was, intelligent, capable, full of potential, but without the financial resources to develop their abilities. I want your company to give them the opportunities that circumstance denied them." Mia's expression shifted, uncertainty replacing her previous confidence. For the first time since he had entered her office, she looked genuinely unsure. A scholarship fund of that nature would require significant resources and extensive planning. It would need approval from the board of directors. I can't promise something like that unilaterally. Then we don't have a deal. Ethan stood preparing to leave. He had anticipated this moment during the elevator ride up, had made peace with the possibility that his principles would cost him this opportunity. Some things were simply worth more than money. Mr. Brooks, please wait. He stopped walking but didn't turn around. I cannot promise that the board will approve it immediately, Mia said, her voice carrying a note of genuine appeal. These things require time, politics, persuasion, building consensus. It could take 6 months to achieve. It could take a full year, possibly longer. She came around her desk to face him directly. But I can promise you this much. I will personally advocate for that fund in every board meeting. I will fight for it until it becomes reality, no matter how long it takes or how much resistance I encounter. You have my word. Your word. Ethan let the phrase hang between them, weighted with history. Last night, your word was used to humiliate me. I know. For the first time, something resembling shame crossed Mia's carefully controlled features. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove that I can be better than that. Not because I deserve the chance, I know I don't, but because you gave me something last night that I had forgotten I ever possessed. You reminded me of the girl I used to be before success and power corrupted her, the girl who believed that dignity was more important than money. Ethan turned to study her face, looking for deception, and finding only the raw vulnerability of someone standing at a crossroads. He thought about Emma asleep with her drawing, about Olivia, who had always believed fiercely in people's capacity for change, about all the nights he had swallowed his pride to keep a job that had slowly eroded his sense of self. And he thought about what it might mean to work for someone who had witnessed him at his most vulnerable and chosen to offer respect instead of retaliation. I'll try, he said finally, but understand this clearly. The moment you break your word, I'm gone. Mia extended her hand, and Ethan saw that it trembled slightly. Fair enough. They shook, her grip firm and her eyes steady despite the slight tremor. When can you start? Monday. I'm going to spend this weekend with my daughter. 3 years later. The conference room on the 50th floor was alive with screens showing faces from 3 different continents. Tokyo glowed with early morning light. Paris sparkled with afternoon sun, and New York hummed with mid-morning energy. Ethan moved between languages like water flowing between stones, Japanese for the Tokyo team, French for the Parisian office, English to weave it all together into coherent strategy. He had grown into this role in ways he never could have predicted during that desperate night when he sat at his kitchen table staring at bills he couldn't pay. The exhausted single father who once carried serving trays now led international negotiations that shaped the company's future. The man who had been called useless had become genuinely indispensable, but some things remained exactly as they had always been. Every day at 3 Goshagi, regardless of what meeting was scheduled or what crisis was unfolding, Ethan left the office to pick up Emma from school. Every evening they had dinner together at their kitchen table, a nicer table now in a larger apartment, but the ritual remained sacred. And every morning they still practiced Japanese together, though these days Emma corrected his pronunciation more often than he corrected hers. She was 9 years old now, sharp and curious, and increasingly fluent in both Japanese and the French she had recently started learning. She had Olivia's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and she carried a growing understanding that Ethan had given her something more valuable than the comfortable life they now enjoyed. The unshakable knowledge that dignity was never negotiable, no matter the price offered. The scholarship ceremony took place in a ballroom that Mia had personally selected for the occasion, a space grand enough to honor the magnitude of what they had built. 30 children sat in the front rows, with their families gathered behind them. Families who had never imagined seeing their children's names printed on scholarship certificates, whose entire worlds had been transformed by a fund that had nearly failed to exist at all. The fund had required 11 months to establish exactly as Mia had predicted. She had fought for it through 7 contentious board meetings, overcoming resistance from executives who saw no profit margin in helping underprivileged children learn foreign languages. She had alternately threatened and persuaded, cajoled and demanded until finally she had won. Now she stood at the podium announcing the name that would be attached to this fund for as long as it existed: the Ethan Brooks Scholarship Foundation. Ethan sat in the second row with Emma beside him, close enough to see the emotion flickering across Mia's face as she spoke. When she said his name, Emma tugged at his sleeve with wide, wondering eyes. "Daddy," she whispered. "Did you know they named it after you?" "I knew. Are you proud?" Ethan looked at the 30 children receiving scholarships, young people who reminded him viscerally of himself at their age, bursting with potential that poverty had tried its best to bury. He looked at Mia, who had somehow transformed from a woman who insulted strangers into someone who fought board meetings to fund their futures. And he looked at Emma, who had spent 3 years watching her father refuse to be diminished by anyone. "I'm proud of you," he told her, squeezing her hand gently. "Always have been. Always will be." After the ceremony concluded and the families had departed with their scholarship letters, Mia found Ethan standing alone by the windows. The city sprawled below them, a vast maze of lights and shadows, and 8 million separate stories. "Thank you," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "For what?" "For refusing to stay silent that night in the restaurant, for giving me the opportunity to become someone better than I was." She gazed out at the same view he was contemplating. "You could have walked away so easily. Most people certainly would have." Ethan considered her words for a long moment before responding. 3 years ago, you asked me why I didn't bow when you insulted me. I told you my dignity wasn't for sale, but that wasn't the complete truth." He turned to face her directly. "The complete truth is that I wanted desperately to bow. I wanted to apologize and keep my job and go home to my daughter as if nothing had happened. It would have been so much easier, so much safer. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I would tell Emma someday when she asked me what I did when someone tried to take my dignity away. And I realized I couldn't teach her to stand up for herself if I didn't know how to stand up for myself." Mia nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "You didn't actually change me," she said. "You simply reminded me of who I was always supposed to be. I had forgotten her completely somewhere along the way." "That's all any of us can really do for each other," Ethan replied. "Remind each other of who we're supposed to be." They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 people who had somehow navigated from a moment of cruelty to something that resembled genuine redemption. "Daddy!" Emma materialized at his elbow, practically vibrating with barely contained energy. "Can we get ice cream now? You promised we could." Ethan smiled, a real unguarded smile, the kind that had become wonderfully frequent over the past 3 years. "I did promise. Let's go." He took his daughter's hand and walked with her toward the elevator. At the doorway, he paused and looked back at Mia one final time. "See you Monday." "See you Monday, Ethan." The elevator doors closed, and father and daughter began their descent through the gleaming tower, leaving behind the rarefied world of power and money for something far simpler. Ice cream on a beautiful evening. Time together that could never be bought or sold, and the quiet certainty that some things would always be worth more than any salary. People often say that dignity is a luxury the poor cannot afford to indulge in. But Ethan Brooks had learned something profoundly different through his journey from that restaurant to this moment. Dignity doesn't depend on money or status, or the opinions of people who think they're better than you. It depends entirely on whether you possess the courage to stand up when the world is trying its hardest to push you down. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person that others underestimate the most turns out to be the one capable of changing